Have you ever trusted someone so much only to realize they were quietly trying to erase you from your own home? It's a strange kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't come from strangers or enemies, but from people who share your family name, people you once fed, hugged, and prayed for. My name is Eleanor Ainsworth, and I'm 82 years old. I've seen wars end, empires fall, and good manners disappear faster than old-fashioned decency. Yet nothing prepared me for the day I came back from a short trip and found out that the woman married to my son had claimed the one place I thought no one could ever touch, my room. Now, when I tell you this story, don't think it's about anger or revenge. No, it's about boundaries and what happens when people mistake your kindness for weakness. Before I tell you how my daughter-in-law stood in the middle of my bedroom and said, "This is mine now," I want to ask you something. If someone tried to take the space that defines your peace, your sanctuary, would you fight back or walk away? Before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, how far would you go to protect your peace? Because one day, it might be your home. And if you don't learn from what I'm about to share, you could lose everything without even realizing it. You know, people think peace is found in quiet moments, but peace only means something when you've had to defend it. For me, peace lived on the third floor of my home. That space wasn't just a room, it was memory, comfort, and the last piece of independence I had after losing my husband, George. I'd sit there with a cup of tea, watching the light fade through the oak tree outside my window, feeling like life still respected me. But respect is a fragile thing, especially when the younger generation decides they know what's best for you. My son's wife, Veronica, was the kind of woman who smiled with her lips while her eyes measured what didn't belong to her. There's a difference between visiting someone and taking over their air, and she learned that difference the hard way. I had been away for only a few days, a library event, a quiet break, nothing unusual. But as I unlocked the front door that afternoon, a strange stillness met me, a silence that didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like someone had shifted the rhythm of my home without asking permission. Every step up the stairs felt heavier, slower, as if my house itself was warning me, something's wrong. And I should have listened, because what I found at the top changed everything. Stay with me, because what I discovered when I opened that door still makes my hands shake today. When I reached the landing, I paused. My heart didn't race, no, it slowed. There are moments in life when the body understands danger before the mind does. I'd lived in that house for over 5 decades. I knew every sound it made, but this time, it didn't sound like home. It sounded occupied. From the hall, I could see light spilling from my bedroom door. The door was half open. My door had never been left open. A faint tune drifted down the stairs, something electronic, cold, careless. Veronica's kind of noise. I wish I could tell you I stormed in right then and there, but I didn't. I stood still, fingers pressed against the banister, trying to decide whether I was about to witness carelessness or theft. The answer, as it turned out, was both. People think age makes you harmless. They see gray hair and assume surrender. But the truth is, age makes you dangerous in quieter ways. We've learned where patience ends and consequences begin. So when I finally pushed that door open, I wasn't the frail grandmother she imagined. I was the woman who built this house, who paid every bill, who buried a husband under the promise that this place would always remain mine. And what I saw inside that room marked the moment she lost her claim to peace. If you're still watching, subscribe right now, because one day, someone might walk into your home and act like you don't belong there. Don't wait to understand how it feels when it's already too late. At 82, you don't chase excitement anymore. You protect peace like it's gold. My home was my last treasure, a 3-story Victorian on the edge of Charleston, standing proud with its tall windows and wraparound porch. It wasn't just wood and paint, it was memory carved into every corner. My husband George and I raised our son Ethan there. Every wall still carried echoes of his laughter and the sound of George's footsteps coming home after work. When George passed, I didn't move out like people suggested. They said, "It's too big for you, Ellie," but they didn't understand. That house wasn't too big, it was just right for everything I'd lived through. I spent a year turning the third floor into my private sanctuary. A soft-lit reading room, a small kitchenette, and a master bedroom that overlooked a live oak that had stood longer than I had been alive. I'd start every morning there, open the curtains, watch the sunlight filter through the branches, and whisper, "Good morning, George." I was old enough to know that peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from ownership. Knowing something belongs to you because you've earned it. That's why when Ethan called to ask if his wife could stay with me while he worked overseas, I said yes without hesitation. After all, she was family. I told myself I could share my space for a while, but even kindness has limits when someone mistakes it for permission. Have you ever met someone who smiles at you but you can feel they're measuring what's yours? The day Veronica arrived, the house felt louder. She wasn't rude, not at first, just present in a way that filled every room. She wore expensive perfume that lingered long after she left, and her voice carried a kind of certainty that left no space for anyone else's. At first, I tried to welcome her properly. I cooked her favorite meals, offered her tea in my best china, and even cleared a guest room for her on the first floor. She thanked me, but there was a look in her eyes, polite on the surface, but cold underneath, as if she were assessing the place like an investor reviewing property. I began to notice changes almost immediately. My silver trays disappeared, replaced by clear glass ones she called modern. The living room furniture was rearranged to suit her aesthetic. My porcelain dolls, gifts from George, were boxed and stacked in the attic without a word. Every time I entered a room, something familiar was missing. It was subtle at first, like losing air in a slow leak. She smiled sweetly and said things like, "We're just refreshing the space, Mom." That word "we" bothered me more than I cared to admit, because it wasn't we, it was her. But I bit my tongue. I've lived long enough to know that silence sometimes speaks louder than confrontation. Still, the rhythm of my days began to shift. My peace felt thinner, stretched across someone else's idea of comfort. Comment, I understand, if you've ever had to protect your peace from your own family. As weeks passed, Veronica grew comfortable, too comfortable. She hosted virtual meetings from my dining room, rearranged my pantry, and even gave delivery men directions as if she owned the place. Ethan called often, his voice soft and reassuring. "Mom, she's just trying to help," he'd say. But there was something about her help that didn't feel helpful at all. Still, I reminded myself of who I was. I didn't reach 82 by losing my temper over curtains or couches. Every night, I would retreat upstairs, to my third-floor haven, and breathe again. That space was my reminder that some corners of your world must remain untouched, sacred, personal, earned. Sometimes I'd hear her footsteps pacing below me late at night, her heels tapping across the floorboards like an echo of entitlement. It didn't anger me, it warned me. Because when people start to act like they belong in your space more than you do, it's only a matter of time before they forget who truly owns it. I wasn't afraid, not even a little. I'd survived harder seasons and colder hearts, but I could sense that this was leading somewhere, a quiet test of will between generations. She saw an old woman. I saw a lesson waiting to be taught. That's the thing about storms. They rarely arrive with thunder. At first, they begin in whispers, in small trespasses you almost forgive. I didn't know it then, but the storm had already started, quietly. The first thing I noticed wasn't the furniture. It was the air. It smelled different, too clean, too polished. My lavender candles had been replaced with something called white linen essence. It didn't smell like home. It smelled like a hotel. When you live alone for years, your home develops its own rhythm. Drawers close softly, clocks tick in their usual pattern. But once Veronica settled in, that rhythm changed. The sound of heels replaced the gentle padding of slippers. The hum of her devices drowned out the peace that once lived in silence. One morning, I came downstairs to find the silver tray George and I received on our wedding day gone. In its place sat a sleek glass bowl filled with lemons. "It brightens the room," she said with a smile. That smile again, polished, unbothered, the kind people wear when they're sure you won't object. She moved things without asking: my embroidered cushions, my reading lamp, the framed photo of Ethan at 10 years old. Everything I loved was being boxed, shifted, or replaced under the name of improvement. I didn't scold her. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched, learning her rhythm. People like Veronica reveal themselves faster when you let them speak freely. That night, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the dim light of my third-floor room, From up there, the house still looked calm, but I could feel the shift creeping upward, slow, deliberate. Would you say something, or let them keep digging their own grave? It started with comments, small ones, almost polite. "Mom, those stairs must be getting harder for you," she'd say as she watched me climb to the 3rd floor. Or, "You know, the guest room would be more comfortable for you, less dangerous if you ever lose your balance." I'd smile and reply, "My balance is just fine, dear." Her tone stayed sweet, but her eyes gave her away. She wasn't offering help, she was measuring my endurance. Every suggestion carried an undertone. "You don't belong upstairs anymore." One afternoon, I came home from my garden club to find her laptop open on my dining table, documents scattered everywhere. My kitchen timer had been replaced with her digital one. She'd even rearranged the spice rack, labeling everything in bold print like I couldn't read. She was settling in, 1 inch at a time, pretending it was all for my benefit. I realized then that her idea of help wasn't service. It was control, disguised as concern. So, I stayed quiet. I watched. You can tell a lot about people when they think you're not paying attention. She thought she was in charge. I was simply taking notes. The truth is, when you reach my age, you stop arguing with arrogance. You let it expand until it runs out of room, and then you close the door behind it. Because when she finally crossed the line, I didn't raise my voice. I raised my strategy. Every evening, I retreated to my sanctuary, my 3rd floor, and took mental inventory of what had changed downstairs. The new rug that didn't match the curtains. The minimalist shelves that replaced my display cabinet. Even the floral wallpaper I had chosen with George was being eyed like an old mistake waiting to be erased. But the more she replaced, the more she revealed. I began to understand her pattern. She wasn't trying to decorate, she was trying to dominate. Every new item she brought in wasn't about style, it was about statement. And I let her. Letting people believe they're winning is the easiest way to see their true intentions. She thought my silence meant defeat. It didn't. It meant observation. At night, as she laughed on her phone calls, I sat by the window upstairs and thought about George. He always said, "Ellie, people forget that patience is a weapon." He was right. Veronica was walking herself into a lesson she wouldn't see coming. I could already sense the confrontation forming, even if she couldn't. The tension didn't need words. It was already in the way she looked at the 3rd floor staircase, that quiet hunger, that belief that youth entitles her to more space than experience ever could. I smiled to myself that night, a calm, steady smile, because I knew something she didn't. Once you start taking what isn't yours, you eventually lose what you thought you owned. I could feel it coming the moment she'd forget her place completely. And when she did, she'd learn that silence can strike louder than any shout. It was a Tuesday afternoon, warm and windless. I'd spent the morning at my book club, chatting with women who, like me, had learned that wisdom grows best in silence. I remember smiling as I drove home, thinking I might bake an apple cobbler later. That calm didn't last long. When I stepped through the front door, something felt wrong. Not broken or missing, just different. There was a scent in the air that didn't belong, not the smell of baking or cleaning products. It was the faint mix of new paint and Veronica's perfume, sharp and synthetic, clinging to every breath I took. I placed my purse on the side table and called out her name, but there was no reply. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels staged. My steps echoed up the staircase, each one felt heavier than the last. When I reached the landing, I noticed something that froze me in place. My door, the one that led to my sanctuary, was wide open. Inside, I heard the scrape of boxes across wood, and the soft hum of music. I took a breath, my hand resting on the doorframe. The sunlight spilling from inside revealed shapes that didn't belong. I pushed the door fully open. My heart didn't race, it hardened. Because standing in the middle of my room was Veronica, arranging her things like she'd always belonged there. Would you keep calm, or let her have it right there? She turned around slowly, almost casually, as if she'd been expecting me. "Oh, hi, Mom," she said, smiling that same rehearsed smile. "I'm just moving in. The lighting here is better for my work meetings." I looked around in silence. My heirloom quilt was gone. replaced by a sterile white duvet that looked like it belonged in a rental listing. My antique desk, the one George gave me for our 50th anniversary, had been pushed against the wall to make room for her oversized monitor. Even my porcelain lamp, the one with the small chip I never fixed, was missing. Her clothes hung from the open closet, shoes lined neatly beneath them. My jewelry box sat on the dresser, but it was empty, my rings and brooches neatly placed in one of her storage bins, as if they were clutter. She didn't look guilty, she looked in control. Her arms crossed as she added, "The first-floor guest room really doesn't suit me. This space is brighter and more modern. You understand, right? It's better for both of us. The stairs are too much for you anyway." It wasn't the words that hurt, it was the assumption, the quiet declaration, that I was being moved aside like furniture that had outlived its purpose. For a moment, I simply watched her. Her voice filled the air where my memories used to rest. "This is mine now," she said with finality, her tone cool, decisive. I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but clarity, because in that instant, I knew she had overplayed her hand. She had no idea she'd just declared war on the wrong grandma. I didn't shout, I didn't tremble, I didn't even correct her. I simply took one long, steady breath and folded my hands together to stop them from shaking. "Veronica," I said quietly, "what do you think you're doing?" She sighed, clearly irritated by the question, as if I were the one interrupting her meeting. "Mom, please, you'll be much more comfortable downstairs. I've already moved your things into that small room next to the powder room. It's cozier for you. And you don't have to keep climbing up and down these stairs. You should be thanking me." Cozy. That word sat in my chest like a stone. She meant small. She meant insignificant. But I've learned something about power over the years. People who crave it often mistake silence for surrender. I didn't give her the satisfaction of anger. I gave her composure. I glanced around one last time, my desk, my books, my chair by the window where George and I used to watch the sunset. All of it now occupied by a woman who thought her youth made her untouchable. I met her gaze and said softly, "You've made a decision, haven't you?" Her chin lifted. "Yes, it's for the best." I smiled, a slow, patient smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Well," I said, "you weren't ready for my reply." Then I turned and walked out, leaving her to mistake my calm for defeat. That was her first mistake. Her second was assuming I had nowhere else to go but down those stairs. If you've ever had someone try to erase your worth, subscribe now, because stories like this teach you how to take your power back. And if you don't, you might never see it coming when someone does it to you. I packed a small bag the way someone packs for a short trip, a few nightgowns, my favorite slippers, the teacup that never chips. I moved as though I were consenting to a new arrangement, because people who believe they've won like to be seen with the spoils of victory. Veronica stood smiling in the doorway as I carried my things past her, and she nodded like a queen approving a servant. The room she'd chosen for me was not a room at all. It was a narrow space with one small window, a closet that smelled faintly of old linens, and a bed that had clearly belonged to someone who didn't mind noisy traffic. It was the kind of place real people turn into storage. She'd turned it into exile. I set my teacup on a borrowed nightstand, and Saturday, I could have railed. I could have made a scene, and forced Ethan to take my side right then and there. Instead, I folded my hands and watched her leave the house that evening, with a bounce in her step, certain she'd rearranged my life into something manageable for me. She hummed to herself in the car, oblivious to the fact that the air she breathed had changed. Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's surveillance. I told myself that line like a prayer, not because I intended cruelty, but because I had to remind myself how to be steady. The first week, I kept my distance. I let the house seem to belong to her. I let the hallway lights remain on late. I let her believe the third floor had become a memory she had replaced. She took that as permission. She took it as victory. So she grew bolder. She rearranged more than furniture. She rearranged schedules, her voice becoming the default at dinner, the one who directed visitors where to sit. She answered the phone for me once, giving details about my appointments as if she were my assistant. And little by little, the world downstairs started moving at her pace. But upstairs, in my narrow room, I kept a ledger of observations. Every small theft, a lamp moved. A photograph boxed was noted in the private book I kept in my bag. Names, dates, careless comments recorded between sips of tea. Let people have the impression of triumph. I preferred the advantage of information. Arrogance has a weight to it you can feel in the way someone sits. Veronica began to take positions in rooms I designed, plant her feet where my shoes had once rested, and leave traces of herself, like a path leading back to the truth. She believed this house could be hers to command. At first these were small things, a new lamp where a vase once stood, a stack of business books on my coffee table. Then she began to host work dinners and networking calls right in my living room, asking colleagues to excuse the noise, as though she were the host and I merely a guest. Guests arrived, bearing catered boxes and faux-concerned compliments about my quaint tastes. They praised her choices and rarely met my eye. Her carelessness surprised me. She left receipts in plain view, calls logged on my landline with names I'd never heard. She spoke loudly about goals and partners, bragging over dessert about a potential promotion that would take Ethan overseas even longer. In her sentences, she revealed priorities: status over family, image over loyalty. It's tempting to believe that people change overnight, but the truth is, they reveal themselves in patterns. She was consistent. She believed she could improve everything, including me. Every time she announced a small improvement, I added a line to my ledger. When she rearranged the antiques, I noted the time. When she boxed the quilt, I wrote down the exact words she used to explain it away. When she told Ethan, "I'm just keeping things running," I noted the witnesses. My notebook filled up with the evidence of a different kind of life, one that would be useful in the right weather. And the weather was changing. She began to leave doors unlocked, confident, and careless. She left her email open next to a cup, permissions visible. She signed forms and left brochures from the rental firm on the counter. These were small slips, but their sum revealed a truth. Veronica had created a life that depended on secrecy. She'd hidden income, hidden tenants, hidden choices that now threatened to crumble under light. You can't teach respect to someone who measures everything as temporary. They must learn consequence. My ledger was not a list of grudges. It was a map. I kept it close, and I let the map grow. By the second month, Veronica's confidence felt like a presence in the house. She moved with the conviction of someone who had taken what she believed was owed. She leaned into comfort, confident that I would never make a trip back upstairs to reclaim what was mine. I played my part with the skill of someone who has learned to use calm as a tool. I smiled when she complimented the updated decor. I praised her for arranging a small charity event in my name, while I watched who attended, recorded names, and noted conversations. I accepted tea at odd hours, closed my eyes, and listened. At night, while she slept 2 floors below, I read. Not scandalous novels or gossip magazines, but the sort of careful reading that sharpens focus. Legal guides, neighborhood records, and pages about tenants and trusts. There are rules people forget when they think their advantage is permanent. There are laws that protect ownership and the dignity of one's home. I called an old friend down at the bank and asked casual questions about property records. I spoke with an attorney I had used years ago and asked what it would take to shore up my rights. Each call felt small, but each one assembled another piece of the framework I would need. You understand, revenge was not my aim. Restoration was. I wanted nothing more than the room back and the balance returned. But restoration is rarely just an evening's apology. It requires preparation, proof, and timing. So I waited. I watched Veronica relax herself into our life, and in doing so, reveal the very things that would undo her. She believed the house had adapted to her. She didn't notice it had adapted to reveal her. Have you ever stayed silent, not because you lost, but because you were calculating the win? Because while she enjoyed my bed, I was preparing her downfall. After years of keeping every letter George and I ever exchanged, I'd learned one thing: paper never lies. So, while Veronica strutted through my house as if she'd been written into the deed, I reached for my phone and called the only man who respected both law and silence, Mr. Peterson. He was my lawyer for decades, and he handled matters like people handle fine china, carefully, but with purpose. "Ellie," he greeted me warmly. "You sound calm. That usually means something's brewing." "I need my trust updated," I replied evenly. "And I'd like you to prepare a formal notice for a tenant who doesn't realize she's one." That got his attention. He arrived that afternoon, tie straight, notebook in hand. I served him mint tea in my narrow downstairs room, and we spoke quietly, no raised tones, no gossip. I explained everything. Veronica's decision to occupy my space, her behavior, her assumption that I was too old to fight for what's mine. He took notes without interrupting. Then, sliding his glasses back up his nose, he said, "Ellie, if we're doing this, we'll do it properly. No surprises, just documentation." That's what I wanted. I wasn't interested in drama, I was interested in results. We reviewed my property documents and updated the trust. I asked that every clause be airtight. He drafted an eviction notice under the category of unauthorized occupancy and agreed to keep it confidential until I gave the word. Before he left, he paused at the door. "You've always been fair," he said. "Just make sure you still want to be." I smiled. Fairness is what I'm after, Harold. But fairness doesn't mean letting people steal. Would you confront her now or wait until she can't recover? In war, noise attracts attention. In wisdom, quiet collects truth. I started observing her like a historian watches eras pass. Not out of malice, but to understand patterns. When she left for work calls, I noticed the echo of her heels fading toward the porch, followed by a rideshare pulling up. Each time she came back, new shopping bags appeared, designer, not practical. Her wardrobe grew while her humility shrank. The mailbox became another teacher. Letters arrived under her name from property managers, not clients. There were references to a Charleston Road property, the very house she'd claimed was too damaged to live in. That's when suspicion turned into confirmation. She wasn't jobless. She was profiting quietly while posing as my caretaker. I spoke to an old friend from the neighborhood council, who still had access to housing databases. "Yes, Veronica's house is rented," he confirmed, "and she's charging well above market rate." "Under her legal name?" I asked. "Of course. She's bold, that one." I thanked him and wrote it all down. My ledger was no longer a diary, it was a legal log. Dates, times, evidence, a quiet record of deceit. The more she gained confidence, the more careless she became. Her laptop stayed open. Her phone pinged with work notifications labeled Corporate Client Ethics Review. Irony had a sense of humor, it seemed. At dinner one evening, she laughed and said, "Mom, you should let me handle your finances one day. You're not getting any younger." I smiled gently. That day will come when honesty becomes your habit. She didn't catch it, but Ethan did. His fork paused mid-air. That was the first time I saw a flicker of awareness in my son's eyes. Small, but real. The next step was verification. Assumptions don't hold in courtrooms, so I pursued confirmation. Through Mr. Peterson's network, I contacted an accountant who'd once reviewed corporate contracts. He owed Harold a favor, and within days, he called back with something I hadn't expected. "Your daughter-in-law consults for a firm under strict professional ethics," he explained. "They have what's called a morality clause. If her personal conduct brings disrepute or exposes dishonesty, termination is immediate." That single clause changed everything. She wasn't just disrespectful, she was reckless. If word reached her employer that she deceived her own family for personal gain, her career could dissolve overnight. Still, I didn't plan to ruin her life. I just needed her out, and accountability in writing. So, I built quietly. Each evening after she went to bed, I reviewed property listings and company bios. I printed emails she'd left open. I stored copies in a folder marked Winter Recipes. Let her think it was full of apple pie notes. Every now and then, I'd test her awareness. I'd mention a friend from Charleston Road, and she'd stiffen before laughing it off. Or I'd ask if she ever missed her old home, and she'd say, "It wasn't worth keeping." Lies have weight. You can see them bend a person's posture when they repeat them often enough. My lawyer called to confirm all documents were ready. "Whenever you're ready, Eleanor," he said. "Curtis can deliver the notice personally." "Not yet," I replied. "Let her get comfortable first. People show their truest selves right before the fall." If you're still watching, subscribe because the revenge you're about to witness isn't loud, it's legendary. The closer I got to the truth, the more my peace returned. Some might mistake what I did for vengeance, but it wasn't. It was repair work, long overdue. I had the paperwork secured, the evidence printed, and the law on my side. but something in me refused to act out of anger. Anger fades, truth stands. So I waited until the timing would speak for me. I began preparing my statement for Ethan. It wasn't going to be emotional, it would be factual. Every action Veronica took had a timestamp, every deceit a record. Ethan would see it not as gossip, but as pattern. One night, while reviewing my notes, I found myself whispering aloud, "This isn't punishment. This is restoration." I felt George's photo watching from the dresser, his quiet nod that always meant, "Do it your way." The following morning, I called Mr. Peterson. "It's time," I said. "Understood," he replied. "Curtis will handle service discreetly." I ended the call and looked toward the upstairs landing. Veronica's laughter drifted down from my old room, confident, unguarded. I smiled. Let her laugh. The truth had already started walking toward her. As I turned the last page of my ledger, I wrote one final line. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning justice. Would you have waited like I did, or acted sooner? Tell me in the comments. And if you're still not subscribed, don't wait until someone takes your peace before you learn how to get it back. Timing is a kind of quiet weapon. You don't fire the shot when everyone is looking. You fire it when the sound will carry furthest. Veronica's weekly meeting was always on Friday at 10 sharp, the hour she considered sacred. She polished her presentation all week. She scheduled her calls so that partners in New York and London would log in and see nothing but poise. It was the one moment when she felt untouchable, convinced reputation would shield her from any personal mess. That arrogance made Friday the perfect stage. I told Mr. Peterson the date and asked him to stand by. I called Aisha at the real estate office and said, without drama, "If you could, keep an eye on a property on Charleston Road this Friday morning." I asked Curtis to be available at my door at exactly 10, but to wait for my signal. Everything had to move like a quiet machine, deliberate, clean, irreversible. There was an art to this. I did not want spectacle. I wanted consequences. Loudness gives people the chance to rally. Quiet precision does not. So I arranged 3 actions that would land at once. A practical distraction at the rental property, the legal instrument served at my house, and a measured call to one of Veronica's corporate contacts. Each action alone would sting. Together they would break the illusion she relied on. On the morning of the 10th, I folded my notes and went about my routine tea. A quick tidy of the narrow room, a deliberate calm on my face. Veronica left early, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, confident and untroubled. I watched her go from the window, then closed the curtain, and sat in the quiet I had been cultivating for weeks. It felt like waiting for a tide. When she left, I called Aisha. "The rental property," I said softly. "They should inspect it today. There are reasons." I didn't explain more. Aisha, by nature practical, promised action. I dialed Mr. Peterson next. "Now," I said. He answered with a single, understanding word. "Understood." There's a certain satisfaction in watching a plan begin to move without fanfare. I felt no rush of triumph, only a steady certainty that the truth would finally be given room to speak. I never liked commotion, but I learned how useful it could be. The first move was not to startle Veronica at my front door. It was to unsettle the world she thought secure. At approximately 10:05, after Veronica had settled into her presentation, a short series of events began to unfold miles away at the Charleston Road property. A polite inspector from the property management company arrived on site after a tip I had made that morning. He followed protocol, checking tenant registrations, inquiring about commercial activity, and noting signs of unreported business traffic. He took notes and scheduled a follow-up inspection. That alone would set a small ripple in Veronica's carefully arranged life. It was precise rather than dramatic. A late work delivery found its way to the curb in front of the rental house. A contractor pulled up in a truck and began asking neighbors about permit numbers. These were ordinary details, paperwork, timestamps, a few raised voices from tenants surprised by attention. Nothing scandalous by itself. But for someone who had built a reputation on immaculate control, an inspection can feel like a crack in the mirror. I had not expected the property manager to move with lightning speed. I had simply planned for the manager to begin the process that would make Veronica anxious and distracted. She needed to be off balance. A distracted Veronica is a careless Veronica. Careless people leave their windows open. They forget to close tabs. They do not notice who calls. While the inspection took shape, I tended to the visible household routine as if nothing were happening. I swept the porch, watered a few plants, and pretended to putter about the kitchen. I wanted any neighbor who glanced my way to see a harmless old woman going about her day. That image was part of the plan. It made my later moves all the more effective. When the phone at my landline rang just before 10:30, I did not pick it up at first. I let it ring twice. People judge a ring differently when nothing else is out of the ordinary. When I finally reached for it, I spoke in a tone that did not betray what was happening. Curtis reported he was ready and waiting. Aisha said the inspector had scheduled a brief on-site follow-up. All three pieces were in motion. A well-placed disturbance does not destroy. It reveals the soft points people work so hard to hide. Timing and legal formality together are difficult to argue with. With the inspection underway and Veronica's focus split, I moved to the second phase, the delivery of the notice to quit. Curtis arrived at my front door in an ordinary suit at 10:28. He was professional, discreet, and focused. He carried a single envelope and nothing else. I opened the door and gave him a brief nod. He stepped inside and waited as instructed for the right moment. I could hear the faint murmur of Veronica's voice through the floorboards, crisp, confident, unaware. At precisely 10:33, as Veronica clicked to share the next slide, Curtis rang the bell. The sound moved through the house like any other interruption, small and immediate. She frowned, glanced off camera, and waved an apologetic hand as she excused herself. When she reached the hall, she wore the same calm she always used for minor disturbances. She would not be calm for long. Curtis presented the document with professional straightforwardness, a dated, notarized notice to quit for unauthorized occupancy. He explained in clear terms that the document had been prepared following an update to the trust, and that, legally, she had 2 weeks to vacate. The words were ordinary, administered in a careful voice. At first she scoffed, attempting to smile it away, but the paper had a gravity she could not laugh off. Her phone trembled in her hand. The client faces still visible on her screen seemed suddenly distant. For the first time that morning, Veronica's composure slipped. She stammered about arrangements and called Ethan's name, as if that would conjure rescue. Curtis left the document on the table and, with discretion, returned to his car. He had one job, and did it without spectacle. The notice would not humiliate her on its own, but it created a public record, a time-stamped legal action that could be verified. Paper, as I'd learned, speaks in a courtroom. She stood in my room for a long minute, breathing fast, while the meeting on her laptop went unmuted in the background. Colleagues whispered into microphones, sensing the sudden pause. She tried to rejoin her presentation, but her voice cracked. The professional mask she wore seemed suddenly thin. That small, hand-delivered paper began to feed the second phase. It served both as reality and as a bridge to the next move, exposure that would turn private misdeeds into professional consequences. The last phase required a voice with reach and a demeanor that sounded like concern rather than fury. I dialed the number for the HR desk at one of Veronica's client firms while she stood stunned in my doorway. I spoke calmly, identifying myself and stating facts that could be verified. I did not embellish. I read dates and described actions that were already documented. There was nothing dramatic in my tone, only clear, verifiable information. The woman on the other end of the line was polite, then attentive. In that corporate world, trust and stability are currency. HR does not act on gossip, it acts on risk. I explained that Veronica had been served a notice to quit, that there were questions about her use of residence and undisclosed rental income tied to her name, and that I could provide documentation if the firm required it. I did not threaten. I offered a record. That is enough, in a world that values reputation. While I spoke, I could hear the faint swell of noise from upstairs, the meeting participants, suddenly quiet, the chime of private messages. You don't have to shout to make an entrance when people are already listening. The HR representative promised to escalate the matter to corporate counsel. She asked for the documents and a summary email. I sent what I had, dated and clear. Hours later, whispers reached my son's phone and, through him, the truth landed in places it mattered. Veronica's partner calls became urgent, and her presentation, once impressive, became background chatter for colleagues who had just received a cautious note from their HR team. The collapse was not cinematic. There was no dramatic scene of shouting or doors slammed. It happened in small, consequential ways. A missed partnership call, an abrupt end to a contract negotiation, a message from human resources asking for clarification. Veronica's voice grew quieter. Her messages became terse. A promotion she had touted in one dinner conversation was postponed pending review. She sat on my bed in the afternoon as if stunned, hands clasped, the bright duvet a poor substitute for the quilt she'd tossed aside. The weight of what she had believed would be temporary, a free base of operations, an assumed immunity settled down upon her. I went upstairs later that day to collect a few things. She looked at me and said, barely above a whisper, "You didn't have to do this." I replied, simply, "You told me it was yours." She swallowed hard. There was no defense I could accept after that. When Ethan called that evening, his voice carried confusion and sorrow. He had seen the documents and the calls. He listened to me without interruption and then said quietly, "I wish I'd noticed sooner." He had been loyal to both of us, and now had to choose which loyalty matched truth. By the end of that week, the property was cleared, arrangements had been made, and Veronica left with bags and a hurried explanation. She had assumed my calm meant submission. She had been wrong. Would you have stopped here, or gone one step further? Comment, respect, if you believe some lessons must be learned the hard way. The morning after the notice was served, the house felt unusually still. The air had shifted, not with noise, but with consequence. I could hear Veronica moving around upstairs, her footsteps slower than usual. She was still clutching her phone, making hurried calls that ended with short, strained goodbyes. By noon, I received the first ripple of news. Her company had placed her contract on temporary suspension, pending internal review. Those words are polite code for "you're finished." But we'll make it look procedural. Later that afternoon, Ethan came home early. He had the weary expression of a man who'd been caught between truth and love. "Mom," he said quietly, "there's been talk. HR called me. They're looking into some things about Veronica's consulting work and about her rental." I nodded slowly. "Yes, son, they should." He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees. "Is it true? Did she take over your room?" His voice cracked on the word "your." "She didn't just take a room, Ethan," I said softly. "She took peace and called it progress." He looked away, rubbing his hands together. I could see the turmoil playing behind his eyes, shame, confusion, disbelief. When he finally spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because sometimes," I replied, "it's better to let people reveal themselves than to ruin your integrity trying to prove you're right." There was a long silence after that, the kind that says everything words can't. When Veronica finally came downstairs, her eyes were red, but dry. She didn't look at me. She just handed Ethan a stack of papers, corporate letters, email screenshots, and one message from her manager requesting clarification on residential claims. Her perfect image had cracked, and now the pieces were visible for all to see. Do you think she deserved it, or was it too far? That evening, the house that once echoed with forced pleasantries became heavy with truth. Ethan asked Veronica to sit at the table, not for dinner, but for answers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply asked, "Why?" Veronica tried to defend herself with long sentences about safety, space, and modernization. She said, "I misunderstood, that she only meant to make life easier for me." But her tone betrayed her. It wasn't guilt. It was the loss of control. Ethan listened until her words began circling back on themselves. Then he said something that pierced even me. "You didn't make life easier, Veronica. You made it smaller." For the first time, she stopped talking. He slid the eviction notice across the table. "You'll have 2 weeks to leave," he said, his voice steady. "And you'll need to explain everything to your firm before they make their final decision." Veronica's face paled. She whispered, "You're siding with her?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm siding with the truth." I didn't speak. It wasn't my battle anymore. It was theirs. When the argument ended, she went upstairs quietly, no insults, No slammed doors, just the faint sound of drawers closing and luggage zippers dragging against the wood floor. From my chair, I could see the light from my old room, the one she had claimed flicker as she packed. I expected to feel triumphant, but what I felt was something else entirely. Release, not joy. Not revenge, just release. That night, when she left the house, she didn't say goodbye. The headlights faded into the street, and the silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in months. Drop your thoughts below. Justice or vengeance? The next morning, sunlight stretched across the staircase like it was remembering its old path. I climbed slowly, step by step, until I reached the landing where my door stood half open, waiting, as if it knew I'd return. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the sachet I'd left in the drawer months ago. My quilt, folded neatly in a corner, had survived her redecorating. My books were still there, dusty but intact. The window she once called outdated framed the oak tree perfectly, just as before. I stood in the doorway for a while, not because I needed to admire the space, but because I needed to acknowledge what it took to reclaim it. Some victories are not loud, they don't need witnesses or applause. They only require stillness, the kind that comes when everything false has finally fallen away. I spent that morning restoring order, one deliberate act at a time. The white duvet went first, then the corporate desk, then the tasteless painting she'd hung above my dresser. In their place, I set back the lamp George had chipped years ago, the quilt we'd shared, and my favorite rocking chair by the window. As I worked, I found something surprising. Forgiveness. Not the kind that excuses harm, but the kind that says, you no longer have power here. When Ethan knocked softly at the door later that day, I turned and smiled. Come in, I said. He looked around and sighed with quiet relief. It looks right again. It feels right again, I answered. He nodded. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. I rested a hand on his shoulder. You saw when you were ready. That's enough. Outside, the wind stirred the oak leaves, gentle and certain. Peace, at last, had returned home. Days passed, and the house began to sound like itself again. The steady tick of the clock, the whisper of the curtains, the rhythm of an old life restored. I took comfort not in her absence, but in the presence of calm. Veronica never returned. She sent one letter through Ethan, brief, apologetic, defensive in parts, but not cruel. She wrote that she had lost her position, that she was trying to start over, and that she hoped, one day, I'd understand she didn't mean to hurt me. I read it once, then folded it away in my desk. Some things don't require replies. Justice, when done properly, doesn't need noise. It needs consistency. My victory wasn't that she lost, it was that I regained my boundaries without losing my grace. Sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness. They think age dulls your sense of authority, but wisdom sharpens it. You just learn how to wield it without shouting. When friends from church came to visit, they asked if I felt sorry for her. I told them, I don't feel sorry, I feel restored. And that was the truth. Every evening, I'd sit by the window again with my cup of tea, watching the sunset fade behind the oak tree. I thought of George, of the laughter that once filled the hallways, and of the quiet lessons life keeps teaching no matter how old you are. If you ask me what I learned through it all, I'd say this. Peace isn't something people give you, it's something you reclaim when you remember your worth. And when people cross the line, sometimes silence teaches louder than anger ever could. Do you think I went too far, or did she simply meet her consequence? Let me know in the comments, and remember, some storms don't need thunder to make their point. When people look at older women, they see gray hair and slow movements, but they rarely see what life has carved into us: endurance. It's easy for others to mistake gentleness for weakness, but kindness, in its truest form, is controlled strength, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't chase, and doesn't beg to be understood. I used to think silence was for the powerless. Now I know silence is a choice, a tool sharpened by patience. It lets foolish people reveal themselves without you lifting a finger. What happened with Veronica reminded me that protecting your peace sometimes means standing alone. It's not cruelty, it's clarity. You can forgive someone and still set a line they never get to cross again. You can love your family and still refuse to let them dismantle your dignity. There's nothing cruel about enforcing limits. Boundaries are love with direction. They say, "I'll care for you, but not at the expense of myself." If you're watching this, maybe you've had someone test your patience, chip away at your confidence, or underestimate you because you chose peace over shouting. Don't ever think restraint makes you weak. The strongest people are often the quietest because they know they can win without chaos. If this story taught you something, hit like and share it with someone who needs this reminder. People like Veronica exist everywhere not because they're evil, but because they think the world owes them more space than they've earned. They start by testing small things, moving a photo frame, making a suggestion, changing your tone in conversations, and before you realize it, your own life starts to shrink to fit their comfort. That's why boundaries are essential. Boundaries don't push people away, they show who values you enough to stay within respect. When I told Veronica to find her own place, it wasn't anger speaking. It was wisdom that came from decades of giving too many chances to people who never learned gratitude. The line I drew that day didn't come from hate, it came from peace, a peace that had been stolen and finally reclaimed. We live in a time where people confuse tolerance with surrender. But real peace isn't about letting everyone do as they please. It's about creating an environment where respect is non-negotiable. If you've been letting others cross your lines because you fear conflict, remember this. Conflict passes, but resentment lingers. You either set your limits now, or you spend your days explaining why you didn't. Sometimes protecting your peace means you'll be misunderstood, and that's okay. The people meant to walk with you will never demand you shrink for their comfort. Comment peace if you've ever learned to protect your boundaries the hard way. I know some people will hear this story and say, "You got revenge." But I don't see it that way. Revenge is about punishment. Justice is about restoration. My goal wasn't to destroy Veronica, it was to remind her, and maybe others watching, that actions have consequences, even when the target seems too gentle to fight back. I never yelled, never cursed, never threatened. I just let the truth breathe, and truth is powerful enough to rearrange lives on its own. The beauty of justice is that it doesn't require cruelty. It simply restores what's been disrupted. If you look closely at life, every wrong thing eventually finds its correction. Sometimes the lesson comes through heartbreak, sometimes through silence, and sometimes through the strength of an old woman who's had enough. I've learned that it's not revenge that brings peace, it's balance. When things are set right, you sleep better, you breathe deeper. You stop replaying the moment someone disrespected you, because you've already rewritten the ending. So no, I didn't take revenge, I reclaimed balance, and sometimes, that's the most powerful victory there is. Do you believe she got what she deserved, or do you think I went too far? Tell me your view, I'm listening. As I sit here now, tea in hand, and peace restored, I realize how much this experience taught me. Forgiveness doesn't erase memory, it frees it. You stop carrying the story like a wound and start carrying it like wisdom. I'm grateful for what happened, even the hurt, because every betrayal sharpens your understanding of people, and more importantly, of yourself. George used to say, "The older you get, the quieter your victories become." He was right. I don't need the world to know what happened. I just need to live the rest of my days knowing I didn't let arrogance rewrite my story. To anyone watching, I want you to remember this. Peace isn't handed to you. You have to build it, protect it, and sometimes rebuild it after someone tries to take it. So, here's my final thought and my challenge to you. If you're not subscribed yet, think twice because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're warnings. You don't want to learn these lessons when it's already too late. And if you still won't subscribe, tell me in the comments why you might need this more than you realize. Because the truth is, life has a way of repeating lessons until you finally pay attention. Don't wait until someone disrespects you to discover your strength. Learn it now, live it now. Tomorrow, someone will cross a line with you, and when they do, I hope you'll remember this story. Because sometimes, reclaiming your peace doesn't start with a shout. It starts with a whisper that says, "Not anymore." When I look back on it, all the quiet tension, the stolen space, the long nights wondering whether patience was strength or weakness, I see one clear truth. Peace doesn't protect itself. You either defend it, or you hand it over. Life teaches you in circles, first through kindness, then through disappointment, and if you still don't learn, through experience that cuts deep enough to remind you where your boundaries belong. I used to think age softened me, but no, it refined me. It made me careful with my words, steady with my temper, and confident in my right to be respected. People often mistake maturity for passivity. They think silence means you've run out of courage. But silence, when chosen, is strategy. It's the calm before truth takes its seat at the table. If Veronica taught me anything, it's that peace is a kind of property too intangible, but just as valuable as any deed. And when someone tries to move into it uninvited, you have every right to evict them from your energy, not just your home. I've learned that respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you demonstrate until others realize it's non-negotiable. That's why, before you walk away from this story, I want you to remember this. Never tell a grandma, "This is mine now," because some of us built the ground you're standing on. It's not arrogance, it's heritage. Every generation builds something, a legacy, a lesson, or a warning. What you build depends on how you handle the people who forget where they came from. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. To those who've stayed with me through this story, thank you. You didn't just listen to a tale of revenge. You shared in a story about reclamation, self-respect, and the quiet victory of knowing who you are. Every story I tell has a truth tucked inside it, meant for someone who needs it most. Maybe for you, it was the part about setting boundaries. Maybe it was the reminder that age doesn't make you powerless. Or maybe it was the lesson that calm doesn't mean defeat, it means direction. I tell these stories not for sympathy, but for solidarity. Because somewhere out there, there's another grandmother quietly cleaning her home after being dismissed by people who forget she built it. There's another mother who's tired of being treated like an inconvenience in the house she paid for. There's another soul who's learning that self-respect doesn't require permission. You're not alone. These stories exist so none of us forget our worth, not when the world gets loud, not when others try to shrink us, not when kindness is mistaken for surrender. The older I get, the more I realize the power of being underestimated. People who overlook you hand you the perfect cover to move wisely. They never see the lesson coming until it lands softly, unshakably, and forever. So whether you're a daughter, a father, a husband, or a grandmother like me, hold on to your peace. It's rarer than gold and harder to rebuild than any house. And if you're not subscribing, tell me why in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Because if you're still watching, it means something in this story spoke to you. Don't leave without learning what the next one might teach. Stories never truly end, they evolve. One door closes, another creaks open, and life offers a new test to whoever's willing to pay attention. This chapter, my dear viewers, may be finished, but peace has a way of being challenged again and again. And wouldn't you know it, the very next challenge came from across my fence line. A new neighbor moved in last spring, cheerful smile, loud greetings, a garden shovel in one hand and flattery in the other. She told me she admired my hydrangeas. She said she wished hers looked that healthy. I told her kindly, it takes patience and boundaries, like everything worth keeping. I didn't know then that she would take those words as an invitation to test both. Because a month later, I looked out my window and saw something that made me laugh in disbelief, half my garden, replanted on her side of the fence, roots and all. So next time, I'll tell you about her. The neighbor who thought she could steal my garden, and the lesson she learned when the flowers refused to bloom for her. Until then, remember this, peace without strength invites trouble, but strength without peace creates it. The balance lies in knowing when to stay still and when to act. Thank you for listening, for your time, for your trust, and for believing that stories like these matter because they do. They remind us that wisdom doesn't retire, and respect doesn't expire. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard, and if you're not subscribing, tell me why in the comments. Maybe your answer will be the start of the next story.